It's a delight to welcome everybody tonight. And we have a real treat in store. We are going to be carrying on a conversation with three outstanding speakers all around the theme of naturalism. When we confront nature, we are often struck with a sense of awe and wonder and grandeur, a sense of our smallness in the scheme of things, humility, and profound respect. I mean, consider the shape of a nautilus shell or the multiple shapes of galaxies. Consider the intricacies of just about any organism, the complexities of our brains. All of this suggests that, well, that's the question. What does it suggest? For some people, it suggests, well, there must be a mystery that transcends the natural. The natural is profound and beautiful and magnificent, but it must rest in something that transcends. Call it God, call it whatever you will. Others will counter and say, well, hold on, no, the natural is enough by itself. You don't need the supernatural. In fact, to infer the existence of the supernatural is to move to a completely disrespectful stance toward nature, a stance that demeans the awe and the wonder that we sense when we look at the natural world. Well, tonight we're going to have three speakers try to sort this out for us. They rest in three traditions: the Western Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They are going to be each presenting for a brief period of time and then engaging in some conversation among themselves. The challenge for us as listeners will be to ask, well, to what extent do they agree and why? To what extent do they disagree? And why might that be? Now, it's important to note that they do not speak for their entire tradition. Nobody could possibly do that. But they do recognizably rest within or come to us from specific traditions that have approached the question of nature and the transcendent in their own way. We're going to begin with a presentation by Daniel Spiro. Now, Mr. Spiro is a very interesting man, and we all owe him something, because in his day job, he actually benefits us because he argues the case of the people against corporate fraud. And so that seems to me to be reason enough to listen to him. But tonight he's going to be talking with us about the additional passion of his life, that is to understand more deeply the mystery of nature and what lies behind it through the lens of Baruch Spinoza, the great philosopher and mystic some 350 years ago, who invites us to think about God and transcendence in a way that defies the usual categories. So your attention, please, now to Dan Spiro, speaking to us on the naturalistic philosophy of Baruch Spinoza. Dan, please go ahead.
Okay. First slide, please. Occasionally in history, a figure rises capable of captivating those who fall on both sides of fundamental divides. Today, I would like to talk about a man who has adherents among religious believers and non-believers alike, Baruch Spinoza. And again, if we can have the first slide up, the PowerPoint slide. Goethe called Spinoza the most religious. Novalis called him the God-intoxicated man. And Einstein said that, quote, I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of all that exists. But Spinoza is also the darling of many an atheist, and it is easy to understand why. Repeatedly in his Ethics, Spinoza invoked the famous phrase, God or nature, suggesting to some that his God is nature, nothing more, nothing less. So why believe in God when we can simply all agree that 1, nature exists, 2, God doesn't refer to anything other than nature, and 3, since people commonly speak of a radically different God than what we know of as nature, speaking of God in a non-traditional sense is more confusing than anything else. What's more, Spinoza wrote that nature's laws and rules are always the same. So you can't even find in Spinoza that sense of transcendence associated with the way mystics often speak of God. So goes the argument. All of that is how Richard Dawkins understands Spinoza. Dawkins began his book, The God Delusion, by saying that while he's about to ridicule the existence of God for hundreds of pages, he's not challenging the God of Einstein and Spinoza, because that is mere sexed up atheism. Next slide, please. Sorry, but that view of Spinoza is overly simplistic. If you read the Ethics carefully, you'll see that Spinoza does not merely equate God with nature, if by nature we mean the sum total of animals, vegetables, and minerals in the world. He views God more transcendently, and he uses the divine name to ground his ethical philosophy, so that whatever hope we have for inner peace and blessedness is largely a function of affirming that name. Spinoza starts with the key principle of radical unity, that there exists complete unity of substance, transcending the multiplicity we see, touch, or hear. It is with respect to that source of the unity, the substance, to use his word, where we find God's transcendent element. Spinoza analogized the status of human beings with that of the worms in our bloodstream. From the perspective of a worm, every little object in that bloodstream is separate from one another. However, we understand nature well enough to know that the worm is really part of something larger, the human body. Spinoza takes this understanding one step further. He would argue that the more we understand the world, the more we see ourselves as finite expressions of a single natural unity. Underlying this unity is the divine substance, indivisible, simple, eternal, unbounded, infinite. This God is not what we usually mean by the whole of nature, which is a mere collection of bounded things. Spinoza's God encompasses the single creative unity that underlies, grounds, and powers this diverse world. Now, traditional children of Abraham see God as the pinnacle of goodness. Spinozists see God as the pinnacle of being. For Spinoza, there is no separate creation outside of God. God expresses from within and reveals an infinite number of limited forms, including Homo sapiens. In Spinoza's philosophy, we are natural creatures who fortunately are endowed with the capacity of reason. In short, the place of transcendence in this philosophy is to provide a self-caused, infinite, and timeless source of the unity that powers and underlies our world, expressing infinite things that we can't even begin to imagine. That is why many Spinozists refer to his philosophy as panentheism, indicating that the world as we know it is in God. To be sure, Spinoza's God is not a supernatural Lord with qualities that project human ideals. This God did not create people as a special kingdom within a kingdom. Spinoza's God or nature is univocal. It has one voice, one infinite, indivisible, timeless, eternal, self-caused voice that expresses all of us as properties, states, or modes of the divine. Far more so than most of us, Spinoza begins his philosophy by looking at the whole of reality, not merely by dissecting its parts. But as one commentator said about Spinoza's philosophy, within the very heart of totality, infinity shines through. Spinoza's God may not be supernatural, but remains far greater than a finite mind can envision. How great? I quote Spinoza. To those who ask why God did not so create all men that they should be governed only by reason, I give no answer but this: because matter was not lacking to him for the creation of every degree of perfection from the highest to the lowest. For the laws of his nature are so vast as to suffice for the production of everything conceivable by an infinite intelligence. Unquote. Next slide, please. Perhaps most significantly, Spinoza gives a Jew like me a conception of God that survives the Holocaust. As a friend would say, Spinoza's philosophy is the last refuge of the contemporary Jew who still wants to believe in God. Many of us can't buy into the idea that this world with all its warts came from an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, supernatural Lord. But we can go as far as Spinoza did, which enables us to derive so much emotional sustenance from affirming the name. In Spinoza's case, it provided an object of love and security that enabled him to enjoy, or rather to find joy in learning, the most lasting joy of all, because literally everything he learned about in life deepened his understanding of the divine. In my case, I see the holy name as my benefactor, my muse, the commander of my conscience, my challenge, and the list goes on. Next slide, please. Armed with my love for Spinoza, I have found incredible satisfaction in my own Jewish faith and consider myself a practicing Jew. Nothing feels more natural to me than being with my people while we express our love for God. And the fact that different Jews conceive of God in different ways is, in my view, a strength of contemporary Judaism, not a weakness. I am also happy, however, to report that my interest in Spinoza has inspired me to become more open to finding beauty in religions other than Judaism. Let me start with Islam. I first read the Quran when I was in my 20s, and I didn't like it. I associated it primarily with the incessant use of the word hellfire and the emphasis on the hereafter. Like most Jews, I wasn't interested in those topics. I came to give Islam a second chance in part because of my love for Spinoza. All Jews know the line from Genesis that God created man in God's image. But after reading Spinoza, that didn't ring true. If God is all of nature, known and unknown, how do we get the chutzpah to think of finite, fragile selves like us as being like God or in God's image? Instead of thinking of the likeness of God, I started thinking about the greatness of God. After all, there is no God greater than Spinoza's God, the God that literally encompasses all that is. I fell in love with Islam because it is the Abrahamic faith that most emphasizes the greatness of God. The call to prayer, Allahu Akbar, attests to God's greatness. And near the end of the Quran, we also read about God's uniqueness. Quote, say, He is Allah, the one and only, Allah, the eternal, absolute. He begetteth not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him. Muslims commonly anthropomorphize God too much for my taste. But they stop short of completely fashioning God in the image of human ideals. They respect God's awesome mystery and God's infinitude. As the Islamic Parable says, there are 18,000 worlds, of which our material universe is among the smallest, like a grain of sand in a desert when compared to the invisible domain. Now, the invisible domain contains 7 heavens and 7 earths, encompassed by the divine footstool, which is itself encompassed by the divine throne. And each of these is like a ring cast in the universe when compared to the next. In short, or should I say, a ring cast in the wilderness when compared to the next. In short, no matter how great you think God is, Muslim teachers want you to know that God is unimaginably greater. And that notion appeals to me because of my love for Spinoza, who stresses that God is infinite in every way, and that God expresses God's self in infinite forms and has infinite attributes of which we can only know a tiny number. I love these notions because I never want to be someone who insults or diminishes God. That brings me to Christianity. Like many Jewish kids, I grew up resenting it because of the history of violence and discrimination by Christians against Jews. And I looked at Jesus primarily as an icon, someone worshiped as a god when in fact he was just another finite earthly form. But I have come to realize that Christianity did not do away with God's ultimacy. It simply associated the divine with what is ultimate in human morality: innocence, kindness, gentleness, love. And in the figure of Christ, it strives to give us the ultimate human being with the ultimate mission to save others. Eventually, I was able to open my heart to lines like these from the book of Luke. Quote, "For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves." Yes, it is better in so many ways to eat the finest food and be involved in the finest conversations, but Jesus came to serve. And his mission of service included the teaching that, in essence, Rabbi Akiva was wrong in suggesting that the Torah's greatest principle is to love thy neighbor as thyself. No, Jesus said, the greatest principle is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. I actually agree. Because if you love the name of God, if it so compels you that you wish to be a servant of God, it follows that you will come to serve and to honor. You will come to honor the holy name. You will come to honor the earth God has given us. And you will especially honor and serve your fellow human beings, whose faces are perhaps the most stunning expressions of God known to us. In short, to honor God is to honor all of God's expressions. And that requires a life of service. I don't see anything in Spinoza that is inconsistent with these teachings. Quite the contrary. Final slide, please. Next slide. In short, what a study of Spinoza did for me is to free myself to fall in love with the concept of God that we create for ourselves, taking the best of what other philosophies and religions have to offer. This is made possible when we allow ourselves to appreciate that the word God is large enough to encompass many possible connotations, not simply the one taught to little Jewish boys in Hebrew school, like me or Spinoza. As for the word's denotation, what the word God denotes is the ultimate. And no God concept is more ultimate than Spinoza. His God literally subsumes the all. Traditional followers of Abraham may disagree that Spinoza's God is worthy of the term. They might say that we all know who God is, the supernatural miracle worker referred to in Scripture. Yet we free thinkers are not confined to that conception. Spinoza reminds us that when we say the word God, we can think of what the word denotes, that which is truly ultimate, and recognize that this is something all people should be free to contemplate for themselves. When someone says that to a particular person, money or power is their God, they are truly making the same point I am. They are saying that for this person, money or power is what is of ultimate significance. But we all say that these are false gods because neither money nor power is truly ultimate. In conclusion, like the word God, religion is a regal enough topic to encompass naturalists as well as supernaturalists. Anyone who says differently, anyone who asserts a monopoly for any specific conception of God, and I'm talking about the new atheists who wish to destroy or trivialize the notion of divinity, they fail to honor the mystery of the holy name. That mystery flows from the notion that we are ever so finite, and God, the ultimate one, represents the infinity to which we can only point and never attain. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dan. We've been listening to Daniel Spiro speaking to us in eloquent and passionate terms about the lasting legacy of the writings of Baruch Spinoza and their relevance for our conversation here today. We have two more speakers, and in just a moment we'll go to Maynard Moore. Let me remind you that the question and answer function is available. If you follow down to the bottom of the screen, you will see a little Q&A icon. Open that, and you can type in a question, and we will use those questions in a few moments after we've heard from our remaining two speakers. So welcome to Maynard Moore, who needs no introduction. He's been the first voice that you've seen in all of the previous events in this series. Maynard is a mainstay in the leadership of IRAS and very familiar to those of you who have been to Star Island over the years. Some of you may not know that Maynard is an ordained member of the clergy of the United Methodist Church and holds a doctorate in social ethics. Well, he's going to be speaking to us about his particular view coming out of that tradition in Christianity, his particular view on how to understand, the grandeur, the wonder, the awe that nature inspires in us as a pathway to think about what is ultimate or what we might understand to be God. Maynard, please go right ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Ron. I need to begin this portion of the discussion with a definition and a reference to methodology. When I speak about process, what do I mean? In this context, the word itself has to do with relationality. Both process philosophy and process theology refer to the basic supposition that intellectual coherence in the 21st century requires relational ways of thinking about faith, about personal interactions, about the dynamism of life, and about the universe itself. CJ, do you have the slide up? Relational thinking integrates implications of a thoroughly interdependent universe into how we live and express our faith. Why is this important? Because we live in a scientific age, and it is my contention that the most coherent way to connect philosophy and theology with what science tells us about ourselves and the universe is process thought. Process thought as a system usually references the work of Alfred North Whitehead in the early decades of the 20th century, followed by the work of Charles Hartshorne, who died in the year 2000 at the age of 103. Hartshorne's most eminent students in theology have been Dr. John Cobb at Claremont Graduate School in California, and Dr. Schubert Ogden, with whom I studied in seminary at SMU in Dallas. When I matriculated to the University of Chicago for my doctoral program, the influence there of Charles Hartshorne was still very evident. And so I continue to pursue my own philosophical and theological endeavors within this system of process thought. For me, it is the only way to make any theology cohere with what modern science tells us about the natural world in which we find ourselves. Now, part 2. The truth of what is known in the gift of consciousness cannot be proven. But in our consciousness, there are exceptional experiences that stand out from the ordinary day-to-day sequence of fleeting events. From these exceptional, out of the ordinary experiences arise those impactful, memorable experiences that instill wonder, awe, even humility when we intuit the extraordinary in life. To be fully human is to reflect on these experiences, to make sense, as it were, of this experience and ask, what is the meaning of it all? We don't have to use the word God to give meaning to such experience. And in fact, we can decline to use the word or its equivalent, but we sense that there is something more to the experience of the natural world than what appears on the surface. It is true that Aristotle, perhaps the greatest of all the original metaphysicians, introduced God into his philosophical system without reference to any specific religious influence. And still, his system of natural philosophy makes sense of the real world. Moreover, to give meaning to our experience is not a function of cognitive belief or the acceptance of rational propositions, but is more akin to the direct apprehension of one's relatedness to some aspect of reality that goes deeper than the information that comes from the five senses. In fact, we often realize that the five senses, important as they might be, provide simply sterile information, that we ourselves are the meaning makers in life. To see that this is so, we can easily borrow some terminology from Spinoza and say that one can intuit an ultimate reality actualizing itself in all of the entities and instances we can know and think. It is in this sense that Spinoza referenced his one infinite substance, quote unquote, one infinite substance as the foundation of all things. But for the process theologian, this substance is not a static entity. Rather, it is simply the active ongoingness of things. This is what Alfred North Whitehead called the principle of concretion, and what I am referencing here as the principle of interiority. Now, the remarkable thing is that we humans can recognize that this principle of interiority applies to ourselves as well as to other actual entities in the real world. It means, first of all, we recognize that we are part of the real world. We are a part of nature. But the problem with this is that A, humanity itself can easily become the object of veneration, the deification, perhaps, of something called the human soul, or humanity, or the natural world in all its glory and wonder becomes the object of worship. And this, it seems to me, is what led Spinoza to identify his one infinite substance as God. But this is what leads naturalism towards some notion of sacred nature. This seems to me to be a dead-end street. And it is in this sense that nature is not enough. Turning now to principle number 3. My first claim here is that each of these concepts, faith, hope, and love, and the reality that each points to, I take to exhibit what might be called a human universal. By this, I mean that each of us, is endowed with, at birth, with the capacity for faith, hope, and love. How these capacities are activated and grow, how these initiatives are damaged, recognized, imagined, responded to, perceived, or ignored, powerfully affects who we become as persons, and how, in turn, we manifest faith, hope, and love in our lives. In short, faith is a journey, hope is a journey, love is a journey. Here I want to acknowledge my debt to Dr. John Holt, Emeritus Professor of Theology at Georgetown University, especially his 2017 book, The New Cosmic Story, Inside Our Awakening Universe, in which he says, among other things, quote, "Over the past 2 centuries, scientific advances have made it clear that our universe is a story still unfolding," unquote. A story, of course, in which we all participate. This is a profound statement, and one that all of us in the 21st century need to acknowledge and to explore its implications deeply. And it is a concept completely compatible with what I have already outlined in the first 2 sections of this talk, the process principle and the principle of interiority. Now, to the point of this discussion, I want to claim that we as humans, as Homo sapiens sapiens, have a distinctive place in this unfolding drama. And what distinguishes us from the rest of creation is aspiration. This is much more than what Spinoza identified as appetite, a quality even shared by some primitive life forms. But only the human aspires to something greater than the present circumstance. Only the human can think beyond the earth as a present habitat and initiate an enterprise that launches a probe into the beyond. Only the human can aspire over the rainbow. Specifically, let's turn to the triptych of faith, hope, and love that comes to us from St. Paul. Paul was writing these words to the Gentile community at Corinth while he was imprisoned in Ephesus. So the first thing to note about these 3 words is the essence of practice. These 3 words are not abstractions. They must lead to action. First, faith. Faith is a complex, mysterious phenomenon. In particular, faith must be distinguished from belief. Faith is not simply mental assent. Its embodiment is necessarily interpersonal and public, not otherworldly and private. In all Paul's theology, faith and practice go together. These are the points on which almost all contemporary scholars of Paul would agree. Secondly, faith has no meaning unless it is personal. Thirdly, faith is relational. Even in its most rudimentary form, faith exhibits a pattern of relationship. It manifests itself first in the parental relationship, where bonds of trust and loyalty first develop. These are the bonds out of which a sense of selfhood develops. And as one grows in faith, we enter into and transform our relationships through reciprocity and meaning as we make sense of our lives. As this interactive relationship broadens with both possibility and everyday events, faith enriches our life and is a continuous trajectory into the future. That brings us to hope. Barack Obama's bestseller prior to his presidency was called The Audacity of Hope, in which he outlined his purpose to be reclaiming the American dream, which on the face of it raises a simple question: hope or hype? Perhaps better than anything else in recent memory, this illustrates the mendacity of how the word hope has become hollow. But again, let's see what Paul was saying here. Paul's message is made to fit into a pre-existing history rather than a message that begins with Jesus. That means, in practice, that the message is constrained by the past and develops out of it. But to be clear, for Paul, God brings a genuinely new thing in Jesus. And where the continuity is crucial is in the fact that Paul's vision of hope is rooted in the God who led the Hebrew people out of Egypt, the God whom the prophets of Israel insisted was present with the poor, the oppressed, the left behind, and the God of Jesus, who preached liberation for those downtrodden under the Roman exploitation. And in our own time, the God who manifested a vision for Africans who were sold, whipped, tortured, and yes, lynched under the system of chattel slavery in the United States. Hope is inextricably embedded in the phenomenon of the Black church, woven into Jesus' promise to liberate the poor and the oppressed. Hope is the vision of a future that breaks through despair and radically changes one's perspective on life. It is rooted in aspiration and gives the future a revolutionary mindset to create a future where suffering and oppression will be banished forever. Aristotle, it is true, could speak of hope as a waking dream. But for the Greeks, it was, as often as not, a journey into either tragedy or comedy. Hard to find meaning in either event. But the alternative is not a heavenly utopia. Hope is not pie in the sky. In his dissertation to the Romans in chapter 15, Paul spoke of the God of hope. This is a crucial concept for us. It means that our God has the future as God's essential nature. With Kierkegaard, we affirm, quote, a passion for what is possible, unquote. As my mentor, Bishop Jim Matthews, once said to me in his last days, I don't know what the future holds for me, but I know in whose hands the future rests. Hope is therefore the companion of faith. And faith is the foundation on which hope rests. And in turn, hope nourishes and sustains faith in the future. Together, faith and hope provide a dynamic to life and allows us to love in all our relationships. Love. Everybody knows this word. After all, that's what makes a Subaru, right? Perhaps no other word reaches such a dimension of triviality as this one. But that being said, if it is true that all reality is relational, then love is the ultimate manifestation of that truth. Again, in the words of Paul, there is nothing love cannot face. There is no limit to love's faith, its hope, its endurance. In a word, there are three things that last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of them all is love. This simply is the Christian's credo, the triptych of virtues. Theologian and colleague Thomas J. Ord says, defining love well is foundational to understanding the Christian life. Dr. Ord says, quote, I define love as action, acting intentionally in sympathetic response to God and to others to promote overall well-being in the world, unquote. And Ord makes the point that this is entirely within the framework of modern science. In the physical sciences, it is the mutual attraction of specific elements that create the world that we know. Without the binding of oxygen and hydrogen, there would be no water. Without the interaction of hydrogen and helium, our atmosphere would dissipate. In the social sciences, anthropology, psychology, sociology, and the analysis of actions, behavior, and thought itself relies on observing and affirming the interrelationality in the complexities of all things. Now, one does not have to posit the existence of a deity, not even a monotheistic one, to affirm the truth of this insight. Atheists, agnostics, any stripe of non-theistic outlook can join with us all in affirming the relational reality of the universe. And the great religions of the world simply extract from this the application of the principle to human relationships, which we call love. Major traditions, religious traditions, identify, some of them testify that all creatures exist as a consequence of this love. Philosophy of nature par excellence, Henri Bergson called creativity reality itself. Charles Hartshorne called this the principle of principles. For the Christian, this is what we mean when we say God is love. Quickly, let me turn my fourth principle in this quadriennial on naturalism. And here again, I need to say this is not intended to be a paean to Protestantism as over against other traditions. It's just that the term emerged from a very specific historical period and has implications for us today. One might say that Protestantism is a religious system, but also Protestantism is an idea, and ideas change the world. And that's what irritates and frightens the secularists in our midst. Faith they can deal with, even a system of faith, as an illogical remnant of bygone ages, perhaps admired in a few other cultures, but mocked in our own. But an idea? Now that's a problem. And the last thing secularists will admit to is an insight, is an idea that might change their world. This is partly what led 20th century theologian Paul Tillich to articulate what he called the Protestant Principle, that God alone, not a pope, not the Bible, not any doctrine, not any community of faith, and not nature in all its glory, is to be venerated. This principle, universally significant, is effective in all periods of history. It is pertinent to all the great religious systems of mankind. The Protestant principle contains the protest against any absolute claim to human truth, to any absolute claim made for a creedal affirmation, even if this claim is made by a Protestant church. The Protestant principle is the judge of every religious and cultural reality, including the religions and the religious and culture that calls itself Protestant. 85 years ago, Dietrich Bonhoeffer called for a religionless Christianity, a vision of what he saw emerging within a thoroughly secularized society. But perhaps Emil Durkheim, who more than anyone else shaped the rules for sociological research, was closer to the truth when he argued that society itself is a religious phenomenon. But our time is crucially different from that of Bonhoeffer and extraordinarily different from the 16th century Reformation. The contemporary context is shaped by the phenomenon called secularism. And the turn toward naturalism is part of this phenomenon. But naturalism as religion, in my view at least, falls flat in the world of meaning seekers. Dr. Ursula Goodenough, professor of biology and renowned geneticist, now retired, In her highly impactful book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, teased out a number of experiences accessible to the human being that opens us up to the dimension of reality that transcends the physical world, in which the world in which we live, wonder, awe, imagination, all perceptions present to the scientist as well as a naive bystander. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to diminish the excellence of Ursula's testimony in this book, which I've recommended to others numerous times. But in the end, we still ask, is nature enough to address the big questions of life? Wherein do we find the meaning that we seek in life? How does nature account for critical intelligence? In fact, how does nature account for any subjective experience at all? And if reality requires an understanding akin to process thought, and with our existence in an unfinished universe, what is the source of our aspiration? It is not the beauty of the natural world that provides meaning to our existence, as satisfying and as inspiring as that can be. Rather, it is the awareness that our intelligence, as limited as it may be by time and finitude, is embedded in a deep cosmic process of unfolding life, evolution, and emergence that is being called into a future that is open and adventurous. As Dr. Holt has said, quote, "The forward thrust of nature is not a fiction that humans wishfully invent, but it is a hallmark of the entire cosmic process," unquote. So for me, meaning emerges in the desire of the human to know, an aspiration that finds full flower in the religious hope born out of creativity, and which finds fulfillment in love and the divine intention for shalom to reign upon the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've been listening to Maynard Moore. Thank you so much, Maynard, for that fascinating, insightful presentation, covering a lot of ground that I'm sure we'll come back to in just a moment after we've heard from our third and final panelist. Let me remind everybody that the question and answer function is available at the bottom of the screen. Simply open that up and type your question in, and we will get to them shortly. But next we go to Imad-ad-Dean Ahmad, who is going to speak to us, combining his deep insight into astrophysics. He has the PhD from astrophysics from the University of Arizona, but also his rootedness specifically in the Sunni tradition of Islam. And he's going to be reflecting to us on the same set of questions. What can we know about nature? How does that inspire us to awe and mystery? And is there a step beyond knowing about nature? Is there a reality beyond that we can point to or open ourselves to or even dare to name? Imad, please go right ahead. And as soon as you're finished, then we'll invite Maynard and Dan back to the screen and we'll engage in some conversation. But the floor is yours now. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ron. In the name of God, the beneficent, the merciful, allow me to greet you all with the traditional Islamic greetings. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. For this talk, my definition of naturalism is the concept that the natural universe is real in a meaningful sense and is knowable to the human mind, at least to a degree that allows for some meaningful, if not necessarily complete dominion over and stewardship of it, so that humans are never completely at the whim of supernatural forces, if such forces exist. I realize that some people prefer a definition put forward by David Pompidou, that reality is exhausted by nature, containing nothing supernatural, with the implication that meaning and purpose are human inventions with no objective existence. Those who insist on that definition may find my talk outside the scope of today's subject, or you may prefer to look at the two definitions as a way of exploring the Islamic or an Islamic view that I'm going to present. I'm going to argue that Islam is a system of naturalism within religion, in which God has chosen to create a natural universe that fits this description and appointed man to be his vicegerent in it. First slide, please. And I will discuss, I'm sorry, that's the second slide. Could we go back to, yes, thank you. I'm going to discuss several Islamic doctrines that support this position. The first and foremost is that God created and is the Lord of all the worlds. This concept is part of the declaration of the faith of Islam, which consists of only two parts. La ilaha illallah, that there is nothing worthy of worship except God, and Muhammad Rasulullah, that the Quran is God's revelation to mankind. Notice that the very second or first, depending on how you count them, verse of the Quran begins by saying, "Praise be to God, the Lord and sustainer of the worlds." Notice the use of the plural, worlds. The existence of Islam not only conceives of the existence of a supernatural, but also of multiple natures of a multiverse, that there are multiple worlds, and God is the Lord and sustainer of all of them. Next slide, please. God created man and breathed into him his spirit. What this means is that man has free will, and with that free will, the responsibility to be God's vicegerent. I have a set of quotes from the Quran here. "Behold, the Lord said to the angels, I am about to create man from sounding clay, from mud fashioned into shape. When I have fashioned him in due proportion and breathed into him of my spirit, fall you down in obeisance unto him." Notice that God is declaring that man, who has a free will, is superior to the angels. This contradicts Mark Twain's view that man was created somewhere between the angels and the French. The idea here is that having this freedom of will to be able to choose to do God's will, that unlike the angels who must do God's will, the man who chooses to do God's work on earth is superior to an angel whose doing of God's will is no different from a rock rolling down a hill or a planet floating in its orbit. I have another, I don't know if it's another slide or just further down on this slide. Thank you. "It is he who created for you all things that are on the earth. Moreover, his design comprehended the heavens, for he gave order and perfection to the seven firmaments, and of all things he hath perfect knowledge. Behold, the Lord said to the angels, I will create a vicegerent on earth. They said, wilt thou place therein one who will make mischief therein and shed blood, while we do celebrate thy praises and glorify thy holy name? He said, I know what you do not know." The angels, it's a mystery why God would give this care of the earth into the hands of a creature with free will. Mankind could do many horrible things, and we all know he has. So has God made a mistake here? No. And he taught Adam the names of things. Bear in mind that the word names in Arabic can mean nature as well. And he placed them before the angels and said, tell me the names of these things if you are right. They said, glory to you, of knowledge we have none save what thou hast taught us. In truth, it is thou who art perfect in knowledge and wisdom. He said, Adam informed them of their names. And when he had informed them of their names, he said, did I not tell you that I know the secret of the heavens and the earth, and I know what you disclose and what you hide? And behold, we said to the angels, bow down to Adam, and they bowed down. The next slide. That God created the world in such a way that it is completely subject to his laws, which are discoverable, making worldly phenomena his signs. This is part, this doctrine is part of the argument for why I consider there to be a naturalism within Islam. In the Quran, we see it in how the prophet Abraham, who for Muslims is the archetype of prophethood, how he first arrives, even before he receives any revelation, at the conclusion of the existence of God. So also did we show Abraham the power and the laws of the heavens and the earth, that he might with understanding have certitude. When the night covered him over, he saw a planet. He said, "This is my Lord." But when it set, he said, "I love not those that set." When he saw the moon rising in splendor, he said, "This is my Lord." But when the moon had set, he said, "Unless my Lord guide me, I shall surely be among those who go astray." When he saw the sun rising in splendor, he said, "This is my Lord, this is the greatest of all." But when the sun had set, he said, "O my people, I am now free of your guilt of giving partners to God. For me, I have set my face firmly and truly towards him who created the heavens and the earth, and never shall I give partners to God." The point here is that Abraham, who was born and raised in a society that worshiped the stars as gods and goddesses, in his study of the motions of the planet, sees that they are not godlike, but rather they follow the laws that have been set down for them. They have a nature that has been into them, and by which they must abide. And so he will worship not them, but the God who created them and the laws that govern them. The next slide. Not sure where the slide is. Oh, there it is. Another doctrine is that the serious study of creation can and should inspire appreciation of the Creator. Now, we see this, of course, in the story of Abraham, but we also see it in subsequent developments. Isaac Newton, when he, I'm sorry, this is the previous slide. Okay.
Well, you don't have another slide, so.
All right, I'll just read the quote. We can see this with Isaac Newton. It is interesting that a lot of people felt that Newtonian physics removed any room for God, turned God into an unnecessary hypothesis. Newton did not see it that way. In his general scholium that concludes the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, he says the following: "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And if the fixed stars are the centers of other like systems, these being formed by likewise counsel must all be the subject to the dominion of the one. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as the Lord over all. And on account of his dominion, he is wont to be called the Lord God. And deity is dominion of God, not over his own body, as those who fancy God to be the soul of the world, but over servants. The supreme God is a being eternal, infinite, absolutely perfect. He is eternal and infinite, omnipotent and omniscient, that his duration reaches from eternity to eternity, his presence from infinity to infinity. He governs all things and knows all things that can or can be done, and we adore him as his servants." Another doctrine of Islam in support of the naturalistic view I've outlined is that the subjection of matter to universal laws is a denial neither of God's free will nor that of mankind. Quantum mechanics has undermined the notion that Newtonian physics rules out human or divine will, which, as we've noted, is not a view Newton held anyway in the first place. And chaos theory demonstrates how the smallest material indeterminacy at the quantum level even can be leveraged into an enormous macro scale difference in outcome. That means that given this free will, that we have this duty that has been put upon us to be God's, to serve God's will on earth. When people look at the bad things that happen and say, why doesn't God do something about this? The answer is, he did. He put us here. The question is, why aren't we doing something about it? Quoting from the Quran, "To thee we sent the scripture in truth, confirming the scripture that came before it and guarding it in safety. So judge between them by what God has revealed and follow not their vain desires, diverging from the truth that has come to thee." To each among you, we've prescribed a law and an open way. If God had willed, he would have made you a single people, but his plan is to test you in what he has given you. So strive as in a race in all virtues. The goal of you all is to God. It is he that will show you the truth of the matters in which you dispute. If it had been your Lord's will, they would have all believed, all who are on the earth. Will you then compel mankind against their will to believe? Another principle in Islam is the acceptance of the principle of vicegerent implies a moral mandate that unites faith and action. Again, quoting from the Quran, O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of God is he who is most righteous of you, and God has full knowledge and is well acquainted with all things. Finally, contrary to paganism, the Muslim version of naturalism is not that nature must be worshipped, but rather that the creator of nature must be worshipped. But contrary to materialism, that our life on earth has a God-given meaning and purpose. Nature is important because it is the external evidence of this divine reality, as our own souls provide the internal evidence of the self-same reality. Again, quoting from the Quran, soon shall we show them our signs in the furthest regions and in their own souls, until it becomes manifest to them that it is the truth. Is it not enough that your Lord is the witness to all things? I've always been struck by the echo I find in Kant's reference to the signs in nature and the signs within our own souls to this verse. Well, I'm going to stop here and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've been listening to Imad-ad-Dean Ahmad. Thank you so much for that. Intriguing exploration of the relationship between some of the core traditions of Islam and an understanding, a scientific understanding of the natural world. What is the natural world, and how does it? How do we take it into account religiously? Well, we've heard three views. We are running into a little bit of a problem with time. I've got 5 minutes past 6. I'm wondering if we could agree to put the three principal speakers on the screen at this point and have you talk to each other. Let me see if I can fix this. All right. Have you talked to each other about the conversation that you've all opened up for us here? But specifically, maybe let's invite each one to pose one question for one other speaker. Would that work to get us started here? And let's just see how that goes. A quick round. Each one of you pose one question for one other speaker. And I don't know that it matters in which order we go, but Dan, if you'd like to lead us off, that would be great.
Okay, so I only have one speaker to pose a question to, I gather.
Let's do it that way for start.
I will pose it to Maynard. And the question is this. Would you agree that you could have given essentially that talk and said, I don't affirm the name of God. I'm going to give this talk because I'm not religious. I'm not a God person. I'm spiritual. Or would you say, no, in order to give that talk, you really have to be coming as from the perspective of a believer in God? And if it's the latter, what would be the fundamental God-related principle that you thought you brought to bear in that talk? You're muted. Maynard, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm trying. Okay.
Okay, there you go.
I would say I could give the first two sections of the talk as a person of no faith. But the third and the fourth perhaps would require a specific perspective, which I was trying to provide, referencing my own tradition in which I identify. So the first two sections, yes, I could do that as a non-believer, as it were. And I was trying to make those points to say that we have with anybody who is reflective about our existence as a part of nature, we should be able to agree on those first two principles.
Thank you.
So Maynard, why don't you go ahead and pose a question?
So my my question to my friend Imad is to be a little more specific about the application of your faith tradition to contemporary science. And I know you are very conversant with the quantum universe. So how would you articulate what you outlined as the root, the core of your faith tradition to the current understandings of the world that science brings us?
Well, I think the connection between my understanding of what my faith has to say about the natural world is that the study of the natural world is one of the duties that is put upon Muslims. It is why, at a time when Western Europe was in the Dark Ages, the Muslim world was alive with scientific study, both translating earlier works of European knowledge and Hindu knowledge and Chinese knowledge into Arabic, but also engage in original research. I even wrote a book on this called Signs in the Heavens, which I will now shamelessly plug. But you asked specifically about current science, meaning 20th century onward, which of course has had new scientific revolutions on top of the old ones that we went through. And to me, this is just increasing the for me, it's an increasing of my appreciation for the importance of nature. It's not even so much the way that quantum mechanics and chaos theory accommodates freedom of will, although that's very fascinating to me, but it's rather how this sense of awe that I believe Ron mentioned when we opened the conversation, the sense of awe that one feels about the universe is, I think, even greater. The more we know, the more, at least the more I know, the more awestruck I am by the complexity and the magnificence of the creation. And so I think that whereas and maybe I should make this point too. I mentioned early in my talk that that the declaration of the faith consists of saying there's nothing worthy of worship except God, and also that Muhammad is the messenger of God, meaning the Quran is God's message. One of the fascinating things about that second part is it's understood generally to mean that for Muslims, the Quran is literally the word of God, literally meaning that it is literally God speaking, but not that the text is always literal. Quite the contrary. The text itself says much of what we tell you is allegory. And therefore, if you believe the Quran is the truth, then you have to accept that there are many things in it are allegorical. Now, different Muslims will disagree over which parts are literal and which parts are allegorical, and thus you have a lot of room for disagreement and interpretation. I'm speaking, obviously, I've been speaking from that view that I've been defending, that what I call the naturalistic view. And I think that from that point of view, this mandate to study nature and the means that if look, the Quran, we believe the Quran is the word of God, but we also believe that nature is the word of God. It's called that. It's called the word of God, that God speaks and nature comes into being. So if our study of nature reveals that a certain interpretation of the Quran is not reasonable, then we have to say that, you know, God does not lie in nature or in the Quran. We have to interpret things in a way that resolves that seeming conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Imad, your turn to pose a question.
Yes, I have one question I'm going to pose to Dan. That quote I gave from Newton's General Scholium, in which he distinguishes his own view from those who view God as being the soul of the world rather than its Lord. Some people think that he was talking about Spinoza. I'm interested in your opinion.
Again, I don't know biographically whether Newton was referring to Spinoza, but Spinoza is a common whipping boy among thinkers who view him as reducing God to the subpersonal. And Martin Luther King Jr., who you always hear talked about as if he could have also been a non-believer, right? Because you only hear him talked about in a political sense. He also used the term subpersonal to refer to the so-called God of the philosophers, of which Spinoza's God is the most commonly mocked. You know, again, you could use the term the soul of the universe, but the Spinoza's God it should not be strawmanned as one limited facet of reality. The whole point is that instead of talking about Abraham, you know, the Jewish God and the Christian God and the Muslim God like three little stars in Orion's belt, right? Because they're so similar. Spinoza was opening up the whole sky and whatever is behind the sky. He would speak about God as nature, if you will, natura naturata, nature natured. And he would speak about nature naturans, nature naturing, or substance. So it is easy to straw man Spinoza, and it is easy to adore Spinoza. Pretty much everybody can do both, because and it's, in a sense, it's sort of like Jesus, thinking about him as the founder of so much right-wing political views and left-wing political views, right? People embrace him from these different perspectives. Jefferson is another scholar like that. And I guess that's a strength of a great thinker, but we do have to be careful about straw manning him.
Thank you. Well, I've got 6:15, and we will certainly go past our stated end time of 6:30, but not by more than maybe 5 or 10 minutes. So let me suggest at this point that we begin the process of opening it up to questions from our wider audience. And by the way, let me encourage members of the audience, please pose questions. I'm getting a stream of them, but I'm looking particularly for questions that kind of climb into the space between our three panelists and pose a challenge or invite further reflection, perhaps from all three. And I've got one like that I'd like to lead off with. Well, the questioner uses the word supernatural, and you each might object to that as applicable to the view that you developed. But I have to say, listening to this from my seat, there was a surprisingly clear affirmation of the idea that nature is not all that is, that there is something more, or something that unifies, or something that is all that is. in addition to the natural world. But I'll let you contend over this, the premise of the question. But the question goes like this: is the supernatural more than the creation of the human mind? Why think of God as physical, knowing, or intentional, if indeed you do, particularly knowing or intentional? Why think of God as physical, knowing, or intentional, rather than as a philosophical creation of our minds? So who'd like to lead off in response to, and the core of the challenge, I think, is the idea of whatever exists beyond nature merely a construct of the human mind? Who would like to lead off with that? Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so I'm happy adopting the idea that on some level there is nothing beyond nature. I'm happy adopting the idea that the quote supernatural is a human fiction to refer to conscious breaks in the laws of nature to suit some divine intent. However, I think it's also important to say that nature as we know it is just a tiny speck compared to, quote, nature. That there, again, to quote Spinoza, there are two attributes we know and there are an infinite number of attributes. That should make us really humble about what we know. So really, when one is speaking out against, quote, supernaturalism, it's almost like the conspiracy theory that no one can prove that you're speaking out against. You're speaking out against this humanly created story of a breach in the world as we know it. But you can still embrace the idea of the infinite mystery that overlies and is beneath the world as we know it. And the most important thing that you should learn from science and philosophy is just intellectual humility. So how do we make God as great as possible? How do we recognize our own finitude without stopping loving ourselves and respecting ourselves? And because we must respect ourselves, there is so much to us. But compared to God, what are we? So I guess I kind of largely share the sentiments of the question, but I still think one makes room for the divine, if you will.
So Imad, please.
Well, I agree with what Dan has said, and I would go on to say that I find it a peculiar question. It's basically, here's a point of view. Why don't you agree with this point of view? That the supernatural is a human construct. One could have equally asked, why do you not agree with the view that materialism is a human construct? These are both metaphysical statements. You can't expect to really directly and conclusively answer them using the scientific method by a study of nature. All you can do is inspire someone through your study of nature to one conclusion or the other. In that respect, I would say that the idea, once upon a time, materialists believed that there was only one world. This was the world. The earth was at the center, and planets going around it, and the fixed firmament of the heavenly spheres above that. Their scientific analysis was reasonably consistent with that. But eventually we got to the point where we realized that wasn't right, and we had to change our views. Now, 20th century and 21st century physics has shown that not only can't we adhere to the geocentric view of the universe, but we can't adhere to the view of a single universe, at least not without difficulty. If you believe that this universe is the only one that exists, then you have to struggle with the question about how is it that the fundamental constants work out perfectly for us to be here. For the theist, this is no problem. You can say, well, God made it that way, so what's the problem? For the atheist, you can say, well, because this isn't the only universe. There are an infinite number of universes, all with different fundamental constants. And of course, the only one we know of is the one where we can possibly exist in. And therefore, there's nothing to be explained by divine intervention. But you still have to accept that there's more than one universe. So that's the kind of, and like I said, physics doesn't conclusively answer the question one way or another. But from my point of view, I find it much easier to believe that God has designed this universe without excluding that he's designed others. I believe he's designed others as well. But this one in particular is the one he designed, put us in for our purpose. And while it's physically self-consistent to believe that there are multiple an infinite number of natural universes and no God, yeah, it's self-consistent, but I'm sorry, that's too much of a stretch for me. I have a lot of faith. I don't have that much faith.
So I will respond very briefly, Ron, to that question, because I have been accused of being a supernaturalist or a quasi-supernaturalist or a subversive supernaturalist, because I do talk about God. God is real for me, but I do not use the word supernaturalism because it is a code word, as my colleagues here have recognized. I think it is misleading, as Imad has said. It's a question that is misleading. So I do not believe that one is automatically a supernaturalist by using the word God. It depends on how one interprets that word, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see here. Maybe just to sharpen the point of view that each of you is developing, let's think not about the cosmic, but about the human. Your view of human mind or the human soul, for some people, that in itself is beyond nature, right? There's a transcendent dimension in human consciousness itself. It's clearly part of the natural world, but it is not ruled by the laws of nature. My guess is that each of you would object to that, but it might help our listeners to hear how you would think about that, and how if you do object, how you would state that objection. Again, anybody want to lead us off? Daniel, I see you're unmuted already.
Oh, I've just been unmuted. Yeah, I guess I would state that we have no evidence to talk about the human mind other than in naturalistic terms. We certainly understand the majesty of, for example, consciousness, which is different than the objects of our consciousness. It's the experience of our consciousness, which is something that we can hardly describe with words. And so we can point to that which is beyond our ability to know or even conceive when we talk about the human mind. But if the question is sort of posing some sort of teleology or divine purpose that we can know about beyond what we study, I'm not able to do that. I'm not able to come up with that. And similarly, I don't spend a lot of time, as I indicated earlier, thinking about the afterlife, if there is any. It's not how I serve this planet. It's not how I serve my own pleasure. So I don't really make room, nor am I here to refute that. I'm with Kant on that issue, right? We just don't know.
Thank you. Maynard or Imad?
Well, I don't use the words God's plan. I don't use, I don't usually use the word soul because of the connotation of the word is something that you carry around in your back pocket and you can pull it out when you need to. There is a sense of self that we all carry, and that is a creation of the mind. That is, when we reflect on our own being, when we reflect on the larger world, which we are here calling nature, we sense that there is something deeper than we can see. And we recognize that we are a part of it. And I do use the word intention, that I said at the end that I believe that it is God's intention for shalom to reign in the world. Now, that means something different from a plan, but it means that it refers to something that is the root of our aspiration. And that is, it doesn't mean that God intended for us to be here. I do affirm that the intention of God for intelligence to emerge in the universe, I do say that that is part of God's intention, but it doesn't mean that it would have to be us any more than it's limited to us on this planet. But it's what I refer to as, and what Dr. Holt refers to as, the awakening universe. The universe is awakening to itself through the emergence of intelligence, whatever form it takes.
Imad?
The question that I answered previously, the questioner had superseded the need to use the word supernatural by using the words intentionality and knowledge with regard to God. Why I think that introspection supports the views that I've been outlining is that by introspection, I know of my own intentionality and my own knowledge. The problems of referring to God's plan that Maynard referred to, I understand and I appreciate that. And yet I noticed that in the Quranic telling of the story of Joseph, which on the surface is very similar to the biblical telling of the story of Joseph, but there's a big difference. And the Quran constantly sermonizes on how this is a question about God's plan, that Joseph's faith is that he knows that God has a plan, even though he can't quite figure out what it is. And the superficial evidence would seem to be against it. But that plan has to do with Joseph's intentionality. Joseph has to do God's work and God's will. And that's what he's committed to doing, even when there's a sparsity of evidence that anything good is going to come out of it. To quite the contrary, things look horrible. All kinds of, he becomes a slave, and goes to prison, and you name it. Whatever can go wrong goes wrong, and yet in the end, he's vindicated. I think that and again, this is all subjective. Other people. You have to look into your own soul. I'm not going to look into someone else's soul. I look into my own soul, and I have no problem with the word soul. The word nefs in the Quran that is translated as soul can also be translated as self. And this is another question that is, a challenge. For the materialists, they not only question the existence of free will, but even the existence of the self, that the soul or the self could be an illusion. We think that we have intentionality, but we don't. It's all just a consequence of material action going on in our brain that somehow we think, if that's not a self-contradiction, that we think is a reflection of our own intentionality and our own knowledge. Well, again, you'll have to look into your own soul. I looked into mine. This is what I found.
I'm going to take the risk that we can have two more questions here. So you'll have to help me as we move through at least the first one. One questioner posed the word imminence. Now, we've talked some about transcendence. Does the word imminence play a role in your thinking? And if so, what is that role?
So let me respond to that. And my answer is unqualified yes. And that has to do with the all-inclusivity that Dan referenced of the divine. All that is encompassed by the divine. Now, we only can make that affirmation by referencing concrete experiences that we have in our everyday life, and in other instances, the extraordinary experiences that we have. And it is in moments like that that we come to realize that we are in the presence of the divine. And it's always a beckoning to us to evaluate where we are, what we are doing, and what we are called to be. It's a call to which we respond. We can ignore it. Many people do ignore it, but it is always there.
I'll just say quite obviously, I agree with that because, the philosophy I was talking about is a quote, philosophy of imminence. So I won't take any more time on that question.
Yeah, I also agree. It's and I'm grateful for the question because it's something I would have liked to have spoken about and didn't have the time. That the Islamic view of God is both transcendent and immanent. He says he's, on the one hand, he is the Lord of all the universes, of all the worlds, and he says, I am closer to you than your jugular vein.
Well, let's end with this question, and it takes us to kind of a different space. So let me invite you to respond however you see fit and to use it as an opportunity to make a closing comment. And we'll try to wrap this up in about 5 minutes total. I have to embellish the question. That's part of my job here. But Mike writes, to be a person is to experience sorrow. Let's expand that a little bit and say it's not simply to experience love and love lost, not simply to experience grief. What human being escapes those experiences, but particularly the sorrow of the intellectual who cannot escape consciousness of the horrors of history, the recalcitrance of injustices wherever we look, or the impending sorrow unless we find some way to deal with the ravages of climate change. To be an intellectual, I think, is to be aware of the dimensions of sorrow on a broader scale. How do you tie your faith to a response here. I mean, I like to believe, I like to say to students, it all begins in love and ends in joy. But then I'm mindful of the sorrow. How does your particular perspective address this huge polarity of sorrow and joy?
Right.
Go ahead, Dan.
I guess I'll start. Okay. So first of all, the question reminds me of the statement by Heschel that you kind of can judge a person on the basis of the extent of the deep problems they're concerned with. But of course, the concern in this case is very clearly a concern of the heart, empathy, and not just a concern of the mind. In terms of my faith, I talked about earlier the idea of, excuse me, all of us being expressions of the one God. Sorry about that. And how that requires us to honor one another. So if you are looking at the world and those in it, and I've been a vegan for 27 years with honor, then you are going to be concerned about more than yourself and your family and your faith. See a deer and the idea of someone shooting it for fun as opposed for mercy. You see a little mouse and the idea of not saying the Kaddish when you kill it, right, inside your house. That's not showing honor. So, I mean, to me, and it's funny because there was a question in the Q&A about how can you love a God that doesn't love you back? Proposition 19 of part 5 of the Ethics is actually my favorite proposition, and Goethe's and all of Spinoza. Religion should stop being about loving God so that God can pay you back. Religion should be about bestowing love and honor and respect gratuitously, precisely because you've been inspired to be empathic, to love, right? Not because you expect some reward in the afterlife. That's the opposite of religion for me. So yeah, it's about showing honor to all of us. It's about that line about being at the table. It's better to be at the table with all the big machas, but I am here to serve. And there's a great Quranic, I think it's Surah 80 about Muhammad who ignored the blind man, and you know, because the big shots were there. And apparently what I heard from my Sunni friends, the Shia friends I know say that Muhammad couldn't have done that, is that every time Muhammad saw the blind man after that, he said, "It is he on whose behalf Allah admonished me." I mean, that is religion. That is religion, not how we suck up to people, but how we treat the mouse in the house.
Thank you, Maynard or Imad.
All right, so so I would say this. Sorrow and suffering comes with life because we live in a natural world that where suffering and killing and abuse and oppression are part of the evolutionary process that have brought us to this place. But we are called to be more than that. We are called to answer, as Steven Pinker says, to respond to the better angels of our nature. To me, that is why I am a follower of Jesus. Because, as Dan has said, Jesus calls us beyond the oppression and the sorrow and the conflicts of life. So and in affirming the imminence as well as the transcendence, how do I apply that to the divine? Well, the only way I know and I can talk about God is through what Jesus has represented to me. So I can say, God is what Jesus does. That sums it up for me as a Christian.
Yeah, I think that what Maynard has said about hope, faith, and love is how religion provides the means of dealing with sorrow. And from the Islamic tradition, I can give you two quick examples. I mentioned the story of Joseph before. In that surah, that chapter describing the story of Joseph, Jacob is castigated or criticized for constantly bringing up Joseph when he's been led to believe that Joseph is dead. And Jacob says, I only complain of my sorrow to my Lord. The other example is a Sufi parable. A Sufi, I forget which one it was, but a Sufi teacher remarked about how one time he saw God in a dream, and in his dream, he said to God, Lord, I have been seeking your love for 60 years. And in his dream, God responded, and I have loved you from one eternity unto another.
Thank you. I can't imagine a better saying with which to end this conversation. Thank you all very much. Thank you to Dan and Maynard and Imad. Thank you all for your honesty, your intelligence, your engagement, and opening up this space for this exploration and stretching of our awareness and of our appreciation of the extraordinary, complex, difficult, challenging questions that confront human beings as we think about the mysteries, the profundities, the awe that greets us in the natural world and whatever it is that might lie in it and beyond it. Thank you all very, very much.